Chapter 5 of Charles Sumner, the Scholar in Politics, by Archibald Grimké. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Hercules tests the temper of his weapons. During the earliest years of the slavery agitation, Sumner was too young to take either a very earnest or a very active interest in the subject. When Garrison was in jail in Baltimore, he was in college at Cambridge, and during the next few years he lived, moved, and had his being almost wholly in the bright and stately world of books, far away from the madding crowd of public issues, engrossed in his profession and the companionship of scholars and thinkers. But in 1835, probably directly after the great mob in Boston, which dragged Garrison through its streets, he became a subscriber to the Liberator. His father was the sheriff of the county of Suffolk at the time, and strove manfully to rescue the anti-slavery leader from the murderous violence of the rioters. The son's subscription to the Liberator was doubtless intended to express his decided disapprobation of the mob spirit and his disposition to resist its encroachments in the interest of slavery upon the liberties and institutions of the North. A year later, the reader will recall how hotly he resented the indignity received by Samuel E. Sewall at the hands of the baffled slave-catcher, and with what indignation he wrote his law-partner George S. Hillard from Paris in relation to the tameness with which the Northern members of Congress allowed themselves to be bullied by Southern representatives, and how rather than submit to it he was ready to dissolve the Union. A month before he sailed for Europe, the frightful period of anti-slavery mobs had culminated in the murder of Elijah P. Lovejoy in the faraway town of Alton in Illinois. Falling, as Lovejoy did, a martyr to free speech and the freedom of the press, the tidings of his assassination thrilled wherever they traveled the free states with horror, aroused in them the keenest apprehensions touching the safety of those safeguards of their liberties. The news of the tragedy reached Boston 3 weeks before Sumner sailed for Europe. He was in the midst of preparations to this end, and so it is impossible to say how much of his attention it was able to draw to itself. Some without doubt, but probably not as much as its importance merited. It would seem from one of his letters while abroad that he was unacquainted with the details of the story, and this is not surprising, seeing that on the very day, December 8, 1837, on which he left the country, occurred the great meeting in Boston, called to denounce the crime, at which his friend Dr. Channing, his law partner, Mr. Hillard, and his classmates in the law school, Wendell Phillips, took leading parts. There was a decided change in this respect almost immediately after his return to the country in the spring of 1840. If there were other questions agitating the public mind then, it did not take the young scholar long to perceive that the slavery question was of paramount interest in Congress and in the country at large. More and more it was sucking into its vast vortex the thoughts and feelings of the free as of the slave states. And no wonder, for the slave power during this time was never more active and aggressive. One had but to look around on the everyday occurrences of the Republic to witness the facts of its fell and determined purpose to extend itself in the nation, to entrench itself in the government, to build high above every other the Babel of its heaven-defying pretensions in the Union. While England was struggling to abolish the African slave trade, America, dominated by the slave power, was throwing her international influence on the other side, opposing with an energy and persistency worthy of a better cause the sublime efforts of English philanthropy and statesmanship to rid the world of that terrific scourge of the natives of Africa. In 1841, Great Britain attempted to enlist by treaty the cooperation of the great powers of Europe toward its abolition. 4 of these powers, viz., Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, declared the trade piracy and granted to each other a mutual right of search for the more effective suppression of the traffic. The final refusal of France to do as much was largely owing to the active opposition of America through its diplomatic representatives at Paris and Berlin. General Cass and Henry Wheaton, so completely subservient had the federal government become to the slave power. And when England, in the determined pursuit of her mighty purpose to put an end to the inhuman traffic, asserted the right of inquiry as to the real character of suspicious vessels sailing under the American flag on the African coast, the whole weight of the State Department of the land of the free and the home of the brave was thrown in the interest of Southern slavery against the English contention. It was then, perhaps, that Sumner made his first essay, after his return home, against the Lernean Hydra, by maintaining in two able and learned articles the soundness of the English position of the right of inquiry on the coast of Africa. These articles appeared in the Boston Advertiser in the winter of 1842, and received the unqualified endorsement of such jurists as Story and Kent. The latter considered them as entirely sound, logical, and conclusive, while Judge Story declared that the second of the articles was written with the comprehensive grasp of a publicist dealing with the general law of nations and not with the municipal doctrines of a particular country. Hardly less heinous than the African slave trade was the coastwise slave trade of the United States. All along the American coast, from the Chesapeake to the Gulf of Mexico, this nefarious traffic in men, women, and children was pursued under the American colors and the protection of the national government. Of the tens of thousands of human cargoes thus transported, occasionally one would come to grief for the traders, but joy for the slaves. Several times were slavers stranded in the channel between Florida and the Bahama Islands, the vessels towed into a British port, and the slaves liberated by the genius of universal emancipation. Between the years 1830 and 1835, 3 such cases occurred in that long and difficult channel. Naturally enough, the owners of the slaves were furious at the loss of their property, and as the coastwise slave trade was imperiled by the proximity of the genius of universal emancipation, the whole South was no less furious. The general government took the matter up and made it the subject of diplomatic correspondence between it and Great Britain, demanding for the owners payment for the slaves so lost. Great Britain did eventually allow the claims upon 2 of the vessels stranded on the Bahama reefs and towed into Nassau prior to the abolition of slavery in her West Indian possessions, but for a 3rd vessel which put into Port Hamilton after that act she finally refused to pay, on the principle that slavery could not exist where her law existed. After the emancipation of slavery in the British West Indies, the air in them became too pure for a slave to breathe, whereat the slave power took great offense. The principle set up by the British government, Mr. Calhoun contended, if carried out to its fullest extent, would do much to close this all-important channel by rendering it too hazardous for use. She is only to give an indefinite extent to the principle applied to the case of the Enterprise, and the work would be done. And why has she not as good a right to apply this principle to a cargo of sugar and cotton as to the slaves that produce it? But the Southern excitement aroused by the case of the Enterprise was comparatively a slight affair to that caused by the case of the Creole. It seems that the brig Creole sailed from Norfolk, Virginia, for New Orleans, with a cargo of 135 slaves in the autumn of 1841. When near the Bahama Islands, 19 of the human merchandise, under the lead of one of themselves, Madison Washington, attacked and overpowered the officers and crew, and compelled the captain, who was wounded in the fight, on pain of instant death, to take the vessel into Nassau. This was done, and in due time all of the slaves were, except the 19, liberated, and the liberation of these followed subsequently upon the receipt of instructions from the English Forest Office in London by the authorities on the island. In the struggle on the Creole between the 19 slaves and the crew, one of the passengers, a slave trader, was killed, and the captain, first mate, and 10 of the crew were wounded. The 19 conspirators acted with singular moderation. What they did they had plainly done only to obtain their freedom. The lives of all the whites on board were spared after the capture of the brig, and there was no disposition manifested to interfere unduly with the property or persons of their prisoners. But for all that, the South set up at once the cry of mutiny and murder on the high seas, and this cry was immediately echoed by its mouthpiece, the national government, through Daniel Webster, then Secretary of State. To Mr. Calhoun, the administration did not display sufficient alacrity in looking after the property interests of its Southern masters. He had not doubted but that a vessel had been dispatched, or some early opportunity seized, for transmitting directions to our minister at the court of St. James to demand that the criminals should be delivered to our government for trial, more especially as they were detained with the view of abiding the decision of the government at home. But in all this he had been in a mistake. Not a step has been yet taken, no demand made for the surrender of the murderers, though the executive must have been in full possession of the facts for more than a month. This was by way of snapper to his whip, of which he was giving the Northern Secretary of State a premonitory taste. Then the slave champion proceeded to argument. He did not doubt that this was mutiny and murder committed on the ocean and on board of one of our vessels sailing from one of our ports to another on our own coast in a regular voyage, committed by slaves who constituted a part of the cargo and forcing the officers and crew to steer the vessel into a port of a friendly power. Now there was nothing more clear than that, according to the laws of nations, a vessel on the ocean is regarded as a portion of the territory of the state to which she belongs, and more emphatically so, if possible, in a coasting voyage, and that, if forced into a friendly port by an unavoidable necessity, she loses none of the rights that belong to her on the ocean. When the ponderous brain of the orator of the 200th anniversary of the landing of the Pilgrims at Plymouth did, however, take up the subject, the apparent indifference to the slave interests of the glorious Union, which Calhoun professed to discern in the Premier's long delay in demanding that the criminals should be delivered to our government for trial, was speedily and altogether dissipated by the pro-slavery character of the dispatch sent by him to Edward Everett, then our minister to Great Britain. And, by the way, the Secretary could not have possibly selected a more thoroughly loyal representative of the slave power than was this same Edward Everett, who once unblushingly declared on the floor of Congress that, though a scholar and no soldier, there is no cause in which I would sooner buckle a knapsack on my back and put a musket on my shoulder than that of putting down a servile insurrection at the South. The British government cannot but see that this case, as presented in these papers, so ran Mr. Webster's dispatch to Mr. Everett, is one calling loudly for redress. For the Creole was lawfully engaged in passing from port to port in the United States. By violence and crime she was carried against the master's will out of her course into the port of a friendly power. All was the result of force. Certainly ordinary comity and hospitality entitled him to such assistance from the authorities of the place as should enable him to resume and prosecute his voyage and bring the offenders to justice. But instead of this, if the facts be as represented in these papers, not only did the authorities give no aid for any such purpose, but they did actually interfere to set free the slaves and to enable them to disperse themselves beyond the reach of the master of the vessel or their owners. A proceeding like this cannot but cause deep feeling in the United States. The letter left nothing unsaid with which even an exacting slave champion like Calhoun was able to find fault. On the contrary, it gave him keen satisfaction and elicited his admiration and approval as covering the ground which had been assumed on this subject by all parties in the Senate with great ability. But if Webster and Everett were disposed to range themselves as servitors of slavery in respect of this case, their young compatriot Sumner was not at all so inclined. He took remarkable interest in the subject, and traversed earnestly and ably the pro-slavery positions of the former's letter, which evoked Calhoun's admiration and approval. In the first place, he wrote Jacob Harvey, England cannot deliver up the slaves who are not implicated in the mutiny and murder by which the government of the ship was overthrown. She has laid down a rule not to recognize property in human beings since the date of her great Emancipation Act. The principle of this is very clear. She will not in any way lend her machinery of justice to execute foreign laws which she has pronounced immoral, unchristian, and unjust. It is common learning among jurists that no nation will enforce contracts or obligations of an immoral character, even though not regarded as immoral in the country where they were entered into. Next, as to the slaves participators in the mutiny and murder, their case is not so clear as that of the others, but nevertheless sufficiently clear to enable us to see the way of settlement. And first, I am inclined to believe, indeed I entertain scarcely a doubt, that they became free men when taken by the voluntary act of their owners beyond the jurisdiction of the slave states. Slavery is not a national institution, nor is it one recognized by the law of nations. It is peculiar to certain states. It draws its vitality from the legislation of those states. Now this legislation is, of course, limited to those states. It is not extraterritorial in its influence. Our New England courts have decided that a slave coming to our soil by the consent of his master, as for instance a servant, becomes entitled to his freedom. The invigorating principle of the common law manumits him. It is not so, however, with a fugitive slave. And why? Because the Constitution of the United States has provided for his surrender. But the case of a fugitive slave is the only one provided for. The courtier of Queen Elizabeth said that the air of England was too pure for a slave to breathe in. I will say that the air of the ocean is too pure for slavery. There is the principle of manumission in its strong breezes, at least when the slave is carried there by the voluntary act of his owner. If I am correct in this view, these slaves were remitted to their natural rights. They were justified in overthrowing by force, not mutinous or murderous, because justifiable any power which deprived them of their liberty. In doing what they did, therefore, they have not been guilty of any crime. They are in the same situation with the others who did not participate in the alleged murder. But in the next place, suppose we are wrong in this view, suppose they were not justified in rising as they did, suppose, in short, that they have committed the crime of murder under our laws. Still, I say, England will not be obliged to give them up. The crime will be piracy by statute and not by the law of nations. Now, it is perfectly clear by the law of nations, and no nation has acted upon this rule more than the United States, that no government can be called upon to surrender persons who have offended against the municipal laws of another government. It is, of course, within the discretion of a government to surrender such offenders, but it is no just cause of complaint that a government refuses to exercise this discretion. There can be no doubt that England will refuse to exercise it. Webster's dispatch was one of the first proofs of his consent to wear the collar of the slave power in his uncurbed and insane ambition to be president. It gave Sumner great offense, and he was sternly outspoken against its sophistry and its paltry, uncertain, shifting principles. Indeed, so marked was his condemnation of the letter of the Secretary that to George Ticknor he seemed the only person met by him who disagreed strongly with it. But for all that, Sumner was not the only person who was vehement against it. Many others were vehement against it likewise, and among these was Dr. W. E. Channing, with whom Sumner was on terms of intimacy. The doctor felt so warmly on the subject that he published a pamphlet in reply to Mr. Webster's pro-slavery dispatch. Sumner took the most lively interest in the pamphlet, which the author read to him in manuscript and submitted later, when set up in press, the proofs of it for his critical assistance and suggestions. The young scholar rejoiced that such a voice was to be heard in the country and to cross the sea. To his brother George he wrote on All Fool's Day of 1842, Dr. Channing has put forth a glorious pamphlet on the Creole in reply to Webster's sophistical dispatch. One feels proud of being a countryman of Channing. His spirit is worthy of the Republic and does us honor abroad. His is a noble elevation which makes the pulses throb. Over against this noble elevation was seen Webster's sensibly diminishing moral stature, when, if ever a man had the making of a god within him, it was he, before he had indentured his great intellect to the service of slavery and self. Writing to his brother George in the autumn of the same year, he contrasts Webster and Channing thus: who excels, who equals Webster in intellect? I mean in the mere dead weight of intellect. With the moral elevation of Channing he would become a prophet. Webster wants sympathy with the mass, with humanity, with truth. If this had been living within him, he never could have written his Creole letter. Without Webster's massive argumentation, Channing sways the world with a stronger influence. Thanks to God, who has made the hearts of men respond to what is elevated, noble, and true. Whose position would you prefer, that of Webster or Channing? I know the latter intimately, and my admiration of him grows constantly. When I was younger than I am now, I was presumptuous enough to question his power. I did not find in him the forms of logical discussion and the close, continuous chain of reasoning, and I complained. I am glad that I am wise enough to see him in a different light. His moral nature is powerful, and he writes under the strong instinct which this supplies, and the appeal is felt by the world. Sumner doubtless little dreamt that he himself possessed that very quality which Webster wanted, and which was to make him what that great man for lack of it could not be, a prophet. But of himself as having a leading part to play in the politics of the country he thought not in those days. He was aware of but one thing then, the increasing power of slavery, and in himself of an increasing hatred of that power. It was more and more becoming intolerable to his freedom-loving spirit. "The question of slavery is getting to be the absorbing one among us," he wrote to his brother. "And growing out of this is that other of the Union. People now talk about the value of the Union, and the North has begun to return the taunts of the South." And herein again was he the opposite of Webster, to whom the glorious Union was the be-all and the end-all, and for whose preservation he was disposed to make any sacrifice of the claims of freedom and humanity. To Sumner, on the other hand, the value of a Union dominated by the slave power did not appear so priceless. There were some things upon which he placed a higher value, and which he would not pay to preserve it, and these were his own self-respect and the self-respect of the free states, together with those self-same claims of freedom and humanity which Webster was willing to offer upon the altar of the dear Union. The violent scenes in Congress which were enacting at this time he watched with boiling blood and blazing eyes. John Quincy Adams was making his never-to-be-forgotten fight for the right of petition under the very paws, within the very jaws of the slave power. Whoever else of the Northern representatives chose to wear the collar of the national tyranny, to cringe and crawl between its cruel limbs, to grow pliant and submissive under its brutal blows, not so did John Quincy Adams choose. Threats he answered with defiance, blow with blow, beating back and beating down with the iron flail of magnificent powers the rage of his foes. The brave old Spartan planted himself in this pass of freedom, this Thermopylae of the free states, and withstood for almost a dozen years the Persian flood of the slave despotism in Congress. It made no difference to the veteran statesman what the prayer of the petition was, or from whom emanating, whether for the abolition of slavery or against its abolition, or for the dissolution of the Union, whether from slaves or freemen, it was all the same if forwarded to him. He presented it, unterrified by the tempest which its presentation aroused about his head. The right he held sacred, inviolable, God-given, to be maintained regardless of cost and under all circumstances. In the winter of 1842, the heroic old man, true to his principles and purposes, presented a petition signed by Benjamin Emerson and 45 other citizens of Haverhill, Massachusetts, praying for the immediate adoption of measures for the peaceable dissolution of the Union. This brave act brought the slaveholding hornets in swarms about his devoted head. A resolution of censure was introduced in the House against him, and supported by the most passionate strains of Southern eloquence. But single-handed Adams met and threw back the flood. In close hand-to-hand encounters he has perhaps never been equaled in our parliamentary history, is certainly never surpassed. Quick and ferocious in thrust and retort, he was the terror of the South in debate. He was so now driving home with savage strength, tomahawk and knife, into the foes who ventured within reach of either, until, baffled and defeated, they slunk back with their resolution of censure, leaving the venerable ex-president in the possession of his position, overlooking the right of petition. 6 years before, the slave power in the House, unable to bully him into compliance with its behests in respect of anti-slavery petitions, had adopted its gag rule, that all petitions, memorials, and papers touching the abolition of slavery, or the buying, selling, or transferring slaves in any state or district or territory of the United States, be laid on the table without being debated, printed, read, or referred, and that no action be taken thereon. In the interest of slavery, thus ruthlessly were the right of petition and the freedom of debate of the North struck down in the halls of Congress. Although not approving entirely of Mr. Adams' manners in debate, Sumner nevertheless felt for the grand old champion of the right of petition the most ardent admiration and sympathy. Writing to Dr. Lieber at Columbia, South Carolina, in relation to the attempt of Southern congressmen to censure Mr. Adams for presenting the Haverhill petition, praying for the dissolution of the Union, the young jurist said, "I still stick to Adams. I admire the courage and talent he has recently displayed, and the cause in which they were exerted. I object most strenuously to his manner, to some of his expressions and topics, as unparliamentary, and subversive of the rules and orders of debate. These are among the great safeguards of liberty, and particularly of freedom of speech. One of the worst signs at Washington is the subversion of these rules. No personality is too low for that House, and Mr. Adams erred very much when he spoke of the puny mind of the gentleman from Kentucky, and when he alluded to his intemperance. But still I stick to Adams. His cause was grand. If I had been in the House, I should have been proud to fight under his banner. He has rallied the North against the South, has taught them their rights, and opened their eyes to the bullying — I dislike the word as much as the thing — of the South. I wish you could extricate yourself from that coil. It was exactly as Sumner said. No personality was too low for that House, the Southern portion of it. But subsequent Houses did not stop at personalities, descended in fact to other and yet more brutal methods of debate. Here is an instance, illustrative at once of the iniquitous exactions and violence of the slave power in the government. Joshua R. Giddings, surpassed only by the old man eloquent in those early days in Congress in opposition to the arrogance and aggressions of the South, is upon his feet in the House, which is drawing near the end of its session in 1845. He is making a telling expose of the selfishness of the slave power and of the subserviency of the governments to its interests, citing as an example of the truth of his charge the case of the Treaty of Indian Spring, by which the government not only paid $109,000 to the slaveholders of Georgia for slaves who had escaped to Florida, but added to it the further sum of $141,000 as compensation for the offspring which the females would have borne to their masters had they remained in bondage. Congress actually paid that sum, the orator stingingly observed, for children who were never born, but who might have been if their parents had remained faithful slaves. Upon hearing this wretched chapter of the misdoings of the slave power rehearsed, Southern members went beside themselves with rage and flung fast and furious at the dauntless Ohioan coarse and vituperative replies. E.J. Black, a member from Georgia, specially signalized himself in this respect, to whom Giddings made a scathing retort. Thereupon there occurred this extraordinary scene, which is taken from Wilson's Rise and Fall of the Slave Power in America. Mr. Black, approaching Mr. Giddings with an uplifted cane, said, "If you repeat those words, I will knock you down." The latter repeating them, the former was seized by his friends and borne from the hall. Mr. Dawson of Louisiana, who on a previous occasion had attempted to assault him, approaching him and cocking his pistol, profanely exclaimed, "I'll shoot him! By God, I'll shoot him!" At the same moment Mr. Causen of Maryland placed himself in front of Mr. Dawson with his right hand upon his weapon concealed in his bosom. At this juncture 4 members from the Democratic side took their position by the side of the member from Louisiana, each man putting his hand in his pocket and apparently grasping his weapon. At the same moment Mr. Rayner of North Carolina, Mr. Hudson of Massachusetts, and Mr. Foote of Vermont came to Mr. Giddings' rescue, who, thus confronted and thus supported, continued his speech. Dawson stood fronting him till its close, and Causen remained facing the latter until he returned to the Democratic side. It was such plantation manners and outrageous excesses of the South in Congress which were forcing people like Sumner to think and talk more and more of the value of Webster's glorious union of Northern freemen with Southern slaveholders. Sumner heartily approved of the anti-slavery resolutions offered by Mr. Giddings in the House, asserting the freedom of the slaves on board the Creole under the Constitution, for which he received the censure of the House. "Thank God," exclaimed the young jurist in this connection, "the Constitution of the United States does not recognize men as property. It speaks of slaves as persons. Slavery is a local institution drawing its vitality from state laws. Therefore, when the slave owner voluntarily takes his slave beyond the sphere of the state laws, he manumits him. But suppose it were not true in point of constitutional law, still Mr. Giddings had a perfect right to assert it, and the slaveholders in voting to censure him have sowed the wind. I fear the reaping of the whirlwind." Another aspect of the subject of slavery Sumner had occasion to think and write upon in the winter of 1843. During the visit of his friend Lord Morpeth to the United States in 1842, Mrs. Maria Weston Chapman requested of him a contribution to the Liberty Bell, the little paper published by her every year as a sort of souvenir of the anti-slavery fair of which she was, on the authority of James Russell Lowell, the coiled-up mainspring. Lord Morpeth declined to discuss the question of American slavery on the ground that he was a foreigner, whereupon the advertiser undertook to read Massachusetts a lecture on the impropriety of her citizens doing what the British nobleman's foreign citizenship had withheld him from tampering with. Sumner took the matter up and replied in a cogent article to the contention of that paper: first, that the opponents of slavery in the free states direct their exertions politically against this institution in states to which they are foreigners; and second, that slavery is not an evil within the jurisdiction of the free states or of the United States, of which the free states are a part. Both of these assumptions Sumner vigorously attacked and thoroughly exposed the fallacies upon which they rested. The opponents of slavery in the free states recognized the right of all states to establish, he maintained, within their own borders such institutions as they pleased; and they do not seek, either through their own legislatures or through Congress, to touch slavery in the states where it exists. But while they abstain from all political action on these states, they do not feel called upon to suppress their sympathy for the suffering slave, nor their detestation of the system which makes him a victim. To do this would be untrue to the precepts of our religion and to the best instincts of our nature. Then he disposes of the second assumption by pointing out particular cases to the number of 9, such as slavery in the District of Columbia, in the national territories, in the trade between the states on the high seas under the national colors, in the national constitution, etc., etc., wherein the evil was distinctly within the jurisdiction of the United States, of which the free states are a part. After this survey, he concludes, it would be difficult to see how it can be said that the people of the free states are foreigners so far as slavery is concerned, or that they are laboring to produce an effect without the shadow of right to interfere. On the contrary, the subject is in many respects directly within their jurisdiction. Upon the North, as upon the South, rests the sin of sustaining it. The Supreme Court of Massachusetts, in an elaborate judgment, has pronounced it contrary to the law of nature. The denunciations of the first moralist of the age and the pictures of one of the first poets of the age have marked it with the brand of shame. More than these, the conscience of every right-minded man proclaims that it is contrary to the golden rule of justice. How then can we sustain it? Among the instances enumerated by Sumner in which the free states stood in intimate domestic relations to Southern slavery were the laws of slave states affecting the liberty of free colored persons, citizens of and coming from Northern states. These laws in 2 states in particular, viz., South Carolina and Louisiana, were flagrant violations of the constitutional provision guaranteeing that the citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. The nullification of the Constitution in that regard operated with peculiar hardship in the case of Massachusetts and of her colored citizens, many of whom formed a part of her merchant marine service, and who in the regular course of trade on the Atlantic seaboard had occasion to enter with their vessels at Charleston and New Orleans to discharge and receive cargoes. But the moment that ships having colored seamen on them entered at those ports, they were immediately boarded by the local police, who seized and carried off all of the colored servants and locked them up in workhouses and jails until their vessels were ready to sail, when they were released and allowed to rejoin them. Thus were Massachusetts merchants and shipowners deprived by the laws of sister states of labor which legally belonged to them, and Massachusetts colored citizens of rights and immunities guaranteed to them by the Constitution of the United States. Such gross wrongs and outrages Massachusetts was not at all inclined to endure meekly and non-resistantly, for the sake even of the dear Union. She loudly protested against them, and through her representatives in Congress brought them to the notice of that body. A committee of the House investigated the subject, and Robert C. Winthrop, a member of it, made an able report in which he put the argument of the Northern states, according to Sumner, with unanswerable force and distinctness. Nothing, however, was done by Congress to redress the grievances of the Northern states or to vindicate the national compact as the supreme law of the land. Massachusetts merchants and colored seamen continued to be deprived in Southern ports of privileges and immunities guaranteed to them by the Constitution of the country. When Massachusetts at length became convinced that she could get neither from Congress nor from the South redress of her wrongs, she determined as a last resort to dispatch agents to Charleston and New Orleans for the purpose of protecting her citizens against the violations of their rights in those cities. These agents were instructed to obtain and transmit facts in relation to the imprisonment of her colored seamen, and to test by one or more actions the legality of the local laws by which they were distrained of their liberty. It was in the year 1844 that, in pursuance of her resolution, Massachusetts sent Samuel Hoar and Henry Hubbard on this mission into South Carolina and Louisiana, the former to reside at Charleston and the latter at New Orleans. But no sooner had these worthy gentlemen arrived at the end of their respective destinations and communicated to the proper authorities their official characters and objects than they found themselves the recipients of attentions which, in sooth, they had not counted upon receiving at the hands of the people among whom they were commissioned to reside. Judge Lynch, they were not long in discovering, exercised in Charleston and in New Orleans original and appellate jurisdiction in all matters relating to slavery and to such accredited agents or emissaries as were themselves. A decree of this puissant functionary they presently saw was the supreme law of the land in which they were appointed to dwell. They had supposed, notwithstanding sundry suspicious circumstances and occurrences to the contrary, that the Constitution enjoyed this dizzy distinction and eminence. But that, alas, was an illusion which their experiences rudely and abruptly dispelled. They were made aware in ways not to be mistaken that their society was not wanted, and that the sooner they took themselves out of the cities where they were appointed to reside, the greater would be their chances of getting back alive or uninjured to their homes in the Bay State. Judge Lynch had issued a decree of expulsion against them, and from his Honor's decree there was no appeal in a Southern community, and so Messieurs Hoar and Hubbard, unable to resist, bowed reluctantly to the inevitable and returned to Massachusetts, soberer and far wiser than when they left her. Soberer and far wiser was Massachusetts also in regard to her rights, where they came into collision with the slave interests of the South. She had apparently none which that section was bound to respect. In this subject of the imprisonment of colored seamen, Sumner took great interest. Replying to inquiries addressed to him by Mr. Winthrop touching this question, he wrote a capital letter discussing at length and with much learning and force the civic status of the free colored people of Massachusetts under the Federal Constitution. He demonstrates that they are citizens and that the full measure of their privileges and immunities in Massachusetts constitutes the exact sum to which they are entitled in the several states. It is idle to reply, concludes his admirable argument, that free blacks, natives of South Carolina, are treated to imprisonment and bondage. The Constitution of the United States does not prohibit a state from inflicting injustice upon its own citizens. As the Duke of Newcastle said with regard to his rotten boroughs, shall we not do what we will with our own? But a state must not extend its injustice to the citizens of another state. Unfortunately, the poor slave of South Carolina and the free blacks, natives of that state, are citizens thereof. They owe it allegiance, if a slave can owe allegiance. Of course, they have no other power under heaven from whom to invoke protection, but the freed Negro born in Massachusetts, and still retaining his domicile there, wherever he finds himself, may invoke the protection of his native state. As early as 1843, Sumner had come to entertain a decided repugnance to caste prejudice, the cruel offspring of slavery. Writing to John Jay in acknowledgment of the receipt of his pamphlet on caste and slavery in the church, he observes, "Is it not strange that the church, or any body of men upon whom the faintest ray of Christianity has fallen, should endeavor to exclude the African, guilty of a skin not colored as their own, from the freest participation in the privileges of worshiping the common God?" It would seem as if prejudice, irrational as it is uncharitable, could no further go. Professing the religion of Christ, they disaffirm that equality which he recognizes in all in his presence, and they violate that most beautiful injunction which enfolds so much philanthropy and virtue: love thy neighbor. The Catholic Church is wiser and more Christian. On the marble pavements of their cathedrals all are equal, and this church invites the services of all colors and countries. While in Italy, it was my good fortune to pass 4 days at the convent of Palazzuola, on the margin of the Alban Lake, not far from the supposed site of Alba Longa. Among the brethren of this convent was an Abyssinian, very recently arrived from the heart of Africa, whose most torrid sun had burned upon him. To one accustomed to the prejudices of color which prevail in America, it was beautiful to witness the freedom, gentleness, and equality with which he mingled with his brethren. His dark skin seemed to give him an added interest in their eyes over his great claim as a stranger and brother. In the autumn of 1845, true to his anti-caste creed and his then cardinal moral and political principle of the equality and brotherhood of man, he declined to lecture before the Lyceum at New Bedford on account of its refusal to admit colored people to the lectures on an equal footing with white people. One of the cardinal truths of religion and freedom, he wrote to the committee, is the equality and brotherhood of man. In the sight of God and of all just institutions, the white man can claim no precedence or exclusive privilege from his color. It is the accident of an accident that places a human soul beneath the dark shelter of an African countenance, rather than beneath our colder complexion. Nor can I conceive any application of the divine injunction, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, more pertinent than to the man who founds a discrimination between his fellow men on difference of skin. In lecturing before a lyceum which has introduced the prejudice of color among its laws, and thus formally reversed an injunction of highest morals and politics, I might seem to sanction what is most alien to my soul, and join in disobedience to that command which teaches that the children of earth are all of one blood. I cannot do this. After this brave rebuke, the Lyceum did presently rescind its proscriptive rule, whereupon Mr. Sumner lectured on its platform. Slavery had indeed as many heads as the fabled Lernean hydra, and the prejudice of color was one of the cruelest manifestations in the free states. Almost universally the free people of color in those states were treated as something less than human. In church and state by the highest and lowest classes they were looked upon as objects whom to touch socially was degradation and defilement of the vilest character. They were pariahs whom the meanest members of society were too high and mighty to recognize as men and brothers. They were the poor outcasts whom thieves had beaten and stripped of their human heritage and left helpless in the highway of the Republic, and whom the priests and Levites of the American church and state were passing by on the other side. But Sumner, the good Samaritan, did not so, but with Garrison, Phillips, and the anti-slavery remnant of the North, was trying to bind up their wounds and seeking to restore to them that which the inhumanity of America had wrested from them. Plainly, the slavery question was attracting Sumner's attention more and more, taking possession of his time and thoughts, impelling him irresistibly away from his scholarly seclusion and pursuits into the open, where was raging the irrepressible conflict between right and wrong. Was right in dire need and calling for help, then it was not for him to be indifferent or neutral in such a struggle. More and more frequent, therefore, were his rallies to her succor, and longer and yet more long did he remain fighting by her side. There now began to glow and flame within him a new great purpose, a new moral earnestness and enthusiasm. Hercules, ready for battle, was on his way to attack the Lernean hydra. End of chapter 5.